The church doors opened, the music swelled, and 100 faces turned to look at me, but my eyes instantly drifted to the front row. There, sitting right at the edge of the aisle, were 2 empty velvet chairs. They had been reserved for my mother and father. Throughout my entire childhood, I had imagined my dad holding my arm, whispering that everything would be okay before walking me down the aisle. I had imagined my mother tears-eyed in the front row, vacant, staring back at me like a cold, public rejection. Only 2 weeks prior, my mother's voice had sounded completely breathless and strained over the phone. "Sweetheart, you have no idea how heartbroken we are," she had sobbed, her voice dripping with guilt. "But the house has a massive plumbing failure, the repairs are costing us thousands, and with your father's reduced hours at work, we just cannot afford the plane tickets. We love you so much, but it's simply not in our budget right now." I remember swallowing the massive lump in my throat, blinking back my tears, and telling her that it was okay. I genuinely believed them. I knew they lived modestly, and I didn't want to be a burden. So, I walked myself down the aisle, married the love of my life, and forced myself to swallow the grief of their absence, believing that hard financial times fall on everyone. I comforted myself with the thought that at least they loved me, even if they couldn't be there. But that comforting illusion shattered into a million sharp pieces exactly 6 months later. My younger sister, Chloe, announced her wedding. She wasn't getting married locally either. She had chosen a lavish, high-end coastal venue across 15 states, a cross-country trip that required expensive flights, multi-day hotel stays, and formal attire. When I first heard the news, my heart sank for my parents. I wondered how they would handle the crushing guilt of missing a second daughter's wedding due to their empty bank account. I even considered calling Chloe to ask her to downsize so our parents could attend. Except, the guilt never came. The heartbreak didn't exist. Instead, the family group chat became an endless stream of extravagant updates. My mother posted pictures of a gorgeous, heavily embellished designer dress that cost more than my entire wedding gown. A few days later, my father proudly shared a screenshot of their first-class airline tickets, boasting about the extra legroom. It didn't stop there. They were openly funding a massive portion of Chloe's rehearsal dinner at a 5-star seafood restaurant. I sat on my living room couch, staring at my phone screen in the dim light, feeling a suffocating, icy weight press down on my chest. The plumbing disasters, the mounting bills, and the tight budget that had kept them from my wedding had completely vanished. It became devastatingly, brutally clear, it was never about a lack of money. It was about a lack of priority. Chloe had always been the golden child, the beautiful, demanding baby of the family, and I was the independent, quiet one. They simply assumed I would handle the neglect because I always had. They didn't come to my wedding because they didn't think I was worth the expense. I chose not to make a public scene. I didn't want to ruin Chloe's lead up to her big day, but a quiet, bitter resentment began to simmer deep inside my soul. I watched from afar, through the lens of social media, as my parents flew across 15 states. They threw themselves into Chloe's wedding preparations with an enthusiastic joy they had never once shown for any achievement in my life. Every photo showed them smiling radiantly, sipping champagne, and living a life of luxury. But as the wedding weekend unfolded, the cracks in their perfect, expensive facade began to show, though I wouldn't learn the truth until much later. A month after Chloe's grand wedding, my phone rang. It was my mother. There was no cheerful greeting, no inquiry about how my husband and I were doing, and no warmth. Instead, the moment I answered, she broke into a frantic, hysterical fit of sobbing. She sounded completely broken, her voice trembling with a level of terror I had never heard before. Through her breathless gasps, she immediately began pouring out a story of absolute financial ruin. As it turned out, their desperate, toxic need to give Chloe the perfect wedding, and to keep up appearances in front of her wealthy new in-laws, had driven them to absolute madness. They didn't actually have the money to fly across 15 states. They couldn't afford the first-class tickets, the designer dresses, or the 5-star rehearsal dinner either. But because it was Chloe, saying no was never an option. To pull off the illusion of wealth, they had maxed out 3 separate high-limit credit cards. When that wasn't enough, my father took out a predatory, high-interest personal loan. And in a final act of desperation, they completely wiped out my father's remaining retirement fund. The wedding was over, the guests had gone home, and the reality had finally caught up to them like a speeding train. The retirement money was gone. The monthly minimum payments on the credit cards and the loan were higher than my father's entire monthly income. To make matters worse, they had missed 2 consecutive mortgage payments to fund the trip, and the bank was now officially threatening foreclosure on their home. Collection agencies were calling their phones every hour, and my father, who was already exhausted and suffering from joint pain, was now facing the grim reality of working well into his late 70s just to keep them from becoming homeless. They had literally sacrificed their entire life savings, their home, and their future stability for a single weekend of vanity. "We don't know what to do, sweetheart," my mother wept desperately into the receiver, her voice cracking. "We are losing everything. We were really hoping that you and your husband could lend us a significant amount of money. Just enough to get the bank off our backs and pay off the highest interest loan. Just until we get back on our feet. You've always been the responsible one." I sat in total, heavy silence for a long moment, listening to the static on the line and the sound of my mother's ragged, desperate breathing. 6 months ago, I would have done anything to help them. 6 months ago, I loved them with a blind, desperate loyalty that constantly made excuses for their favoritism. But as I sat there, looking at the photos on my mantelpiece, photos of my wedding day where my husband and I stood alone without my family, something inside me finally hardened into stone. They had flown 15 states for Chloe, risking their livelihood, their home, and their entire future, while they couldn't be bothered to drive a fraction of that distance or spend a few $100s to see me step into adulthood. They had spent everything they had, and everything they didn't have, on the golden child. And now that the bill had come due, they expected the ignored, forgotten child to pay for it. "I'm sorry, Mom," I said. My voice was completely calm, entirely devoid of the explosive anger or tears I thought I would feel. It was the calm of total clarity. "But we just can't afford to help you right now. It's simply not in our budget." Before she could process the words, before she could launch into another wave of tears or pleas, I gently and quietly hung up the phone. They had sacrificed everything for the daughter who demanded their worship, leaving absolutely nothing for the daughter who had actually loved them unconditionally. As I looked around my quiet, modest, and financially secure home, a strange sense of peace washed over me. They were finally paying the true price for their favoritism, and for the first time in my life, I was completely free from the painful burden of trying to earn their love.